The last broadcast. The transmitter stood alone on the cliff like a rusting crucifix. From the service road below, it looked almost humble. 300 feet of lattice steel, guyed to the bedrock, its beacon light winking red every 3 seconds. But from the top deck, where the antenna farm hissed with invisible power, the town of Greyhaven was nothing more than a scattering of salt on black shale. I arrived on the last day of October, when the Atlantic had turned the color of slate, and the wind came off the water tasting of rusted nails. My name, at least the one that still fit, was Jonah Hale. 23 months earlier, I had been the night engineer at WBOS-FM, Boston. Then the cuts came, and the union folded, and I took the only posting left, caretaker of KPHR 93.9, a Class A relic that served maybe 900 listeners, most of them over 80, all of them convinced that FM stood for Frank's Music. The station's real purpose, though, was not music, but survival. Greyhaven had no cell towers, no cable, no fiber. When the big storms rolled in, KPHR was the last voice you heard before the world blinked out. My predecessor, a limping, chain-smoking misanthrope named Stu Redmond, had kept the place running on duct tape and spite for 27 years. When he finally keeled over beside the transmitter shed, the town council sent me a single-line email. "Come keep the candle lit, or we all go deaf." The first odd thing was the silence. I had worked plenty of remote sites, microwave huts on ski slopes, translator shacks in cranberry bogs, but they all carried the same subaudible chatter. Relays clicking, fans exhaling, power supplies humming in minor thirds. KPHR sounded like a tomb. The main transmitter, a 1976 Harris that should have been loud enough to rattle fillings, produced only a soft, metronomic click, 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 like a Geiger counter running down. I traced the fault to the exciter rack. Someone, Stu, presumably, had soldered a crude toggle to the carrier oscillator. In the off position, the station broadcast dead air. In the on position, it broadcast something else. I flipped it to off and called the council president, Mrs. Dunleavy, on the landline. "Everything's nominal," I lied. "Signing on at 1800. "Good," she said. "The children like the lullabies." I hung up, puzzled. Greyhaven had not enrolled a child in its K-8 since 1998. At 5:58 p.m., I fed the emergency automation, a flash drive labeled Safe Playlist, Do Not Deviate. The first track was Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, played on a celesta that sounded underwater. I let it ride. The Harris warmed, the SWR needles twitched. The cliff began to radiate 20 kilowatts of lullabies into the teeth of the gale. Then the toggle flipped itself. Not a relay. There was no click, no power surge. The bat handle simply dropped from off to on, as if an invisible thumb had pressed it. The carrier leaped to 110% modulation, pinning the needles hard right. A blast of white noise roared out of the monitors, followed by a voice. It was a child's voice, high and cracked, speaking words I could almost understand. The consonants slithered between English and something wetter, older. I slammed the toggle back to off. The voice stopped. The automation resumed. I stared at the rack, heart hammering, trying to convince myself a relay had stuck. Then the studio phone rang. "KPHR," I said, throat dry. Silence. Then a giggle, distant, as though the caller stood at the far end of a tunnel. "Don't turn it off again," the child said. "We're still learning the words." The line went dead. I should have left. The service road was still passable. The rental Subaru had half a tank. Instead, I did what engineers do. I traced cables, drew schematics, measured voltages. The toggle was wired to nothing I could find. The path disappeared into a gray conduit that ran straight down through the floor, and then, according to the prints, straight into the earth. The sun set at 4:42. By 6:30, the windows were black mirrors. I made coffee, wrapped myself in Stu's old peacoat, and watched the carrier meter. It held steady. Safe Playlist rolled. Hush, little baby. All the pretty horses. Sleep, child. The day is ended. At 7:11, the toggle flipped again. This time I did nothing. The white noise rose, shaped itself into syllables. The child's voice returned, clearer now, as if the throat had grown a day older. Tell them the story of the tide that forgot to turn. My skin prickled. Greyhaven's founding legend told of a tide that rolled in on All Souls' Eve and never withdrew, drowning half the town before it ebbed at dawn. The voice continued, coaxing, pleading. I reached for the toggle and hesitated. Somewhere in the static, I heard another sound, dozens of smaller voices, repeating the phrase like a playground chant. I killed the carrier. The room fell silent except for the wind. Then, from the loudspeaker above the rack, came a single word, spoken not by the child, but by Mrs. Dunleavy. Jonah. I spun around. The studio was empty. The word had arrived on the Q channel, which was fed by the remote link. The same link that carried my own voice to the transmitter. Theoretically, no one else could key it. The phone rang again. Jonah, Mrs. Dunleavy repeated, though her voice was flat, toneless. Let them finish. They've waited so long. I drove to town. The houses along Breaker Street were shuttered tight, porch lights dark. Greyhaven had no street lamps. The only illumination came from the lighthouse on Folly Point, sweeping its cone across empty docks. I found Mrs. Dunleavy at the library, seated at a long oak table with 12 other elders. Between them lay open photo albums. The pictures were all the same. Rows of children in wool coats standing on the cliff beside the transmitter tower. The earliest was dated 1926, the latest 1979. In every shot, the tower looked identical. No new paint, no corrosion, not a single additional rivet. Mrs. Dunleavy lifted one album and turned it so I could see. The final page showed a boy of perhaps 8, freckled, gap-toothed, holding a sign that read, KPHR, listener number 1000. The boy looked exactly like me at that age. We thought they'd outgrow it, she said. But the tide keeps them 8 forever, and every 30 years the tower needs a new keeper. Back at the site, I climbed the tower. The access ladder was sheathed in ice. Halfway up, the wind tried to peel me off like a sticker. I pressed on, counting rungs. 50, 70, 90. At 120 feet, I reached the first catwalk and a door stenciled RF hazard. The lock had been shot away long ago. Inside was a narrow equipment room, walls lined with coax as thick as pythons. In the center stood a reel-to-reel tape machine, still turning though it was plugged into nothing. The tape was labeled in Stu's jagged hand. Final broadcast. Do not erase. I pressed play. A hiss, then Stu's voice, ragged with exhaustion. If you're hearing this, you're the new Jonah. Sorry, kid. They told me I could walk away if I found a replacement. I didn't believe them, but here you are. The thing in the water feeds on stories. Lullabies keep it small, but every 30 years it wants the real thing, something with teeth. Tonight, it'll ask you to tell it the town's story. You have to give it a version that ends. Otherwise, it starts over, and the tide comes in again. I tried to end it. Couldn't. Maybe you'll be smarter. Or crueler. The tape clicked off.
I rewound the tape, pocketed the reel, and descended. The studio clock read 11:48 p.m. In 12 minutes, it would be November 1st, All Souls Day. I made a decision. If the thing wanted a story, I would give it one. I queued a fresh cart, labeled it Live, Do Not Erase, and sat before the microphone. At 11:55, I threw the toggle to on. The carrier surged. The child's voice flooded the room, eager, hungry. Tell us, it said. I pressed record and began.
Once there was a town that forgot the sea could take everything back. I spoke for 7 minutes, weaving the history Greyhaven had never dared to say aloud. The winter of 1926, when the first children vanished, the bargain struck by the elders, one keeper every 30 years in exchange for the rest, the stories told over the airwaves to lull an ancient hunger, the way each generation pretended not to notice that the lighthouse beam never moved, that the clocks in the church steeple had frozen at 12:07, that the tide pools held faces that blinked away when stared at. I ended with a lie. And the keeper, knowing the price, chose to break the cycle. He climbed the tower with a bolt cutter, severed the feed line, and let the sea take only him. The town woke to silence, and the children never came back, because they were finally allowed to grow old. I hit stop and ejected the cart. The studio remained quiet. Then, from the speakers, came a sigh. Soft, disappointed, but not angry. "Good story," the child said. "We will remember it." The carrier dropped to 0. The lights went out. I waited for the sea to roar up the cliff, but nothing came. After an hour, I dared to open the door. The night was calm, stars sharp as pinpricks. The tide, for once, had turned. I packed a duffel with the essentials, schematics, passport, the reel of Stu's confession, and left the toggle in the off position. The Subaru started on the second try. Halfway down the service road, I glanced in the rear view. The tower's beacon blinked red, steady as a heartbeat. Then, one by one, the lights in the town below winked out, not as if bulbs were failing, but as if people were rising from their beds and switching them off. I reached the causeway by dawn. The radio on the dash, tuned to 93.9, played only static. I did not go back to Boston. I drove south until the pines gave way to palmetto and the air smelled of diesel instead of salt. In a truck stop diner outside Savannah, I mailed the reel to a post office box I hoped no one would ever check. Sometimes, late at night, I pick up a faint signal on 93.9. It is never music. It is a child reciting.
It is a child reciting the story I told, word for word, except the ending changes a little each time. The keeper dies, the keeper runs, the keeper becomes the new voice in the tide. I have learned not to listen too long. The story is still hungry, and somewhere I think the candle is still lit.